Vestiges of the Past, Exploring Enslavement and Agency at Arcadia Mill. And I typically do a talk for Black History Month, similar to this one, but Black history should be celebrated year round. And that's something that we do at Arcadia. So any day of the year, you can walk into our museum and learn about the enslaved, learn about what their lives were like. So we try to celebrate diversity here all the time. Though March is Women's History Month, and we do have a strong female presence here, an enslaved female presence, and I'll talk about that in this presentation. And the reason that I wanted to do this was I am guilty in the past of looking at our historical documents from a very superficial standpoint. A lot of times it's dependent on the audience or time constraints, but oftentimes I'm just referencing these documents, what they are, but I'm not looking at them closely enough. And we need to look closer because when you do, you can start to see these people as individuals, and we can start to weave the stories of these different enslaved peoples based on the records that we have. And another thing I'd like to address is the word agency. That is a heavy, heavy term in archaeology. And I struggled with coming up with a title. And after I created the title and promoted it and then started putting this presentation together, it started to turn into more of a conference presentation and something for the academic community. So agency is a tough term, and there's been a lot of criticism about seeking agency in the historical or archaeological record because it feels like sometimes people are, giving power to the enslaved rather than trying to understand these people as architects of their own actions. So found a really great definition to bear in mind for this presentation, looking at agency in relation to everyday resistance and survival, and trying to find out what actions we can see in the historic record from historical records, but the archaeological record too. And really looking at an enslaved person's ability to fashion their lives and institutions in a way that alleviated the burdens of their situation. So for my academic friends that have tuned in, I'm not going to get too deep into the throes of theory for this presentation, but hopefully this can lead to a little bit more in-depth look at things. And I want to mention too that Ryland Thomas, who did his master's thesis on Arcadia, did an excellent job looking at our historical record and finding a lot of interesting facts about these individuals and the movement of people to and from Arcadia. So I drew from his research a lot as the basis for trying to flesh out more about some of these people and their actual identities. So for anyone that is not familiar with Arcadia, it is located in modern day Santa Rosa County. We own just a very small portion of the original land grant, but through grassroots historic preservation, we were able to save a good majority of the industrial complex and have also acquired significant property that has community aspects. And we'll talk a little bit about that later. I'm going to do just a very brief overview of the historical context, just to set the stage. Arcadia entered the historical record in 1817, so the very end of the Second Spanish period. The Spanish land grant was gifted to a gentleman named Juan de la Rua, and his name's probably familiar for people in Pensacola. He was mayor at one point, and he was heavily involved in the brick industry. So he really didn't do too terribly much at Arcadia, and ended up selling the property in 1828 to Joseph Forsythe, who was a New Englander. We have Forsythe in this area around the 1820s. We know that he had a dry goods store. He was often involved in the shipping industry with his father, who was a ship captain. That'll come into play with these records. But he partnered with the Simpson brothers, who were also established here. They had milling experience. They had the capital that was needed to build a large-scale industrial complex. So Forsythe and Simpson are really the ones that built Arcadia. Another individual involved is Timothy Twitchell. He purchased the northeast quarter of the property and had his own smaller scale industrial complex. This is all water powered. He was into experimental horticulture and tried to catch on to a silk boom that never happened, but he also had the Arcadia Pail Factory. So he was heavily involved on the site as well. Unfortunately, we have no surviving photographs of the mill complex. We do have some of the Simpson House, which you will see. So we rely on artist renderings by Dave Edwards to depict what things were like here at Arcadia. But very quickly, the complex grew. 1830, we know a sawmill was operating, and they continued to add different facilities and really create a complex and not just one mill. And in the interim of all of this, Ezekiel Simpson built a large house. It's been referred to kind of as an antebellum mansion in the southern uplands of the site. And this serves as sort of that community structure in which some of the enslaved later lived around. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. So he built this house in 1835 and actually stood for 100 years until it burned to the ground by accident. But it survived a Confederate occupation that I'll talk about a little bit later too. So the late 1830s, Southern industrialists started questioning their colonial status and starting to question the process of growing cotton, sending it up north to be manufactured, and then the Southerners having to buy back their product basically at an inflated price. And this really led to something called the Cotton Mill Campaign. And it gained a lot of traction, a lot of newspaper articles to draw from. And Forsyth and Simpson also were involved in this notion that they wanted to build a textile mill so that the South could manufacture their own clothes for their slaves and their own products that they needed. There was a little bit of delay in getting it started, but in 1845, they built a 2-story brick textile mill. And there's a lot of historical records to draw from about this because many of the newspapers covered it, but more specifically because the idea of using skilled enslaved people was very controversial because it basically negated the institution of slavery, in which people were stating that African Americans were in an inferior race that were not capable of skilled settings. So this was very controversial. And because of that, we have a lot of great records to look at. This is also a pivotal moment in the enslaved population at Arcadia because previously it had been mainly male dominated, working in the sawmills, cutting the trees. But when they built the textile mill, they introduced 40 female enslaved laborers to actually work the textile machinery. And the thought process was that their smaller fingers and hands could manipulate the machinery better. And we can see this changing the demographic here. And we can see changes in the census records, which I will talk about, because you had an early male population, you introduce females, then we start to see children and family units. And then we start to even see the elderly population towards the end. The textile mill only operated for 10 years. Forsythe died in 1855 and the mill mysteriously burned a few months later. So you can only imagine. And after his death, Ezekiel Simpson was one of his executors. So we have some really great records about executing the estate. And we've drawn from that a lot. And so we have an advertisement here showing where 25 enslaved people from the Arcadia Cotton Factory were going to be auctioned off, and then another 30 to 40 enslaved people to also be auctioned off, if not taken at private sale. So these records are great for us to try and even just getting general numbers of how many people were associated with Arcadia. From what we can gather, in 1855, there were at least 110 enslaved people associated with Arcadia. And the mill complex was put up for public sale, and interestingly, no one purchased it. So it stayed in the Simpson family literally till more recent years when we were able to purchased the site with grant funds through the Santa Rosa Historical Society. So after 1855, we still have a longstanding history. I'm not going to get into too much of the post-Civil War era, but we do have several troop movements through Arcadia. We've got some great accounts of small skirmishes. This one in particular is really interesting. The Confederates were using the Simpson House that I showed you earlier as an outpost, and the Union found out, so they planned a sneak attack. And the most interesting thing to me out of this entire document is that the Union got there in the middle of the night, hid themselves around different buildings, and the Confederates rode up on horses, it says, quote, shouting to the blacks, hurry up with the breakfast. This occurred several months, 3 months after the Emancipation Proclamation. Now, we all know that the Emancipation Proclamation did not just magically break the bonds of slavery, but this shows where there were still African Americans here on site, even after emancipation. And I do have a hypothesis on who I might know who that could have been. But it's interesting to note, just for our timeline, that there's still African Americans here during the war. The Simpson family had fled by this point and had gone to Alabama. So I'm assuming it was a trusted enslaved person to stay behind to look after things. So like I said earlier, we have a lot of great historic records to work from. A lot of the accounts that we have, we obviously have to consider who the author was and what biases they might have. And there is plenty of bias in the record for here. More often than not, it is a white person writing about the history of Arcadia and saying what they recall. And between these records and the Gazette, we constantly see that the enslaved were happy, they were well fed, well taken care of, they didn't mind being there. And we all know, the truth of that. Even if they were treated better than other situations, they were still held against their will. So we have to take a lot of these records with a grain of salt. Something we do draw from are the slave schedules taken up by the US Census. And they are definitely a puzzle for Arcadia, because by the time the textile mill's operating, we've got multiple individuals, we've got stockholders, we've got people who own their own slaves getting into the company. So trying to trace all of that and track it is really tricky. Again, Ryland Thomas did a great job sort of deciphering all of this. But these schedules are great. They obviously don't have names. They just have an age, sex, and color. But they can tell us a lot, even though they are lacking in some respects. And I want to point out something interesting, that the document on the right is when E.E. Simpson was actually looking after Joseph Forsythe's children. After he passed away, his wife moved and remarried, and then she passed away. So the new husband sent the children back to live with E.E. Simpson. And this is showing that these young children, they're minors, own their own slaves. So it's an interesting point to make. So again, very difficult to decipher, but we've learned quite a bit from it, and we can see discrete populations. There is a specific listing where there are 59 enslaved people, and 49 of which are women between the ages of 12 and 35. So those are very likely to be the textile workers, because we know the textile mill was mainly women. Another discrete area that we've been able to kind of highlight is a nursery, and some of the documents talk about how there was a creche or a foundling hospital where the babies and small children were looked after, and then the women went back at stated times throughout the day. And in the slave schedules, there is a discrete listing of one adult woman and mainly children and babies. So this is very likely to be the nursery. We haven't identified it archaeologically on the landscape, but we know that it exists based on this record. So some of the documents that I really focused on for this presentation is the last will and testament of Joseph Forsythe. It's a huge document in special collections at UWF, and I have a few different snippets from that document. And it includes both ledger pages from executing Forsythe's estate after his death, but it also has his last wishes too. So this document shows where 24 enslaved people were auctioned, and then 10 enslaved people were appraised separately and then given to Forsythe's widow. So these documents try to help us, when we look at 110 people, try to track where those people went after 1855. And something to note, Baghdad Mill was operating, owned by the same people. So it would appear that a lot of the labor force was moved to Baghdad or had already moved to Baghdad, but there was still a large number of enslaved people here that they basically tried to dispose of after his death. And one of the most incredible documents that we have is in the Forsythe document, we have enslaved people by name. You don't always get that. And this is what really helps us try to trace these people and weave a story. These names, we've poured through them and then tried to find them in other records. And I have made some connections that I'll talk about today. So another document that we pair with that is shipping manifests. I didn't know this first coming into managing Arcadia, but I've learned it over time through my research and other people's research. The people involved with Arcadia were heavily involved in the interstate slave trade, the domestic slave trade. I mean, it's more than I would have anticipated. The African slave trade was outlawed in 1807, but with the rise of agriculture in the South, that created a need for expansion. And so it was a lot of native-born enslaved people that then were being moved domestically from state to state. But that 1807 law imposed regulations that required captains of inward and outward vessels to provide a manifest if human cargo was on board. And that's huge because it creates a paper trail. Now, did they always follow that? Probably not. But we have a wealth of these shipping manifests to draw from. And most of the time, the individuals are listed by name. And another thing to note is that Andrew Simpson, one of the Simpson brothers, pretty quickly after entering the kind of the Arcadia partnership, moved to New Orleans and set up a very profitable business there at the port of New Orleans. And he too was participating. So there was a ton of travel, human cargo moving between New Orleans and Pensacola, specifically for Arcadia. And we see that throughout all of these records. So this is a great record too that kind of gets us started. In 1836, Forsythe and Simpson actually mortgaged their entire Arcadia property, including 10 enslaved people, to a gentleman named Jasper Strong. And Jasper Strong is another kind of well-known name in the Santa Rosa County area who was a large slaveholder. So we see his name pretty frequently. There is a record of this, incredibly hard to decipher, and I got this copy just a few days ago and just couldn't make it out enough to have it transcribed, but we can see 9 of the individuals' names, and some of these names relate to other documents that we have. And then we see 6 of these people 26 years later on that list of names where Forsythe is auctioning off these individuals. So one of these people, Dick Cotton, we saw him just now coming, established here in 1836 because of that mortgage record. We can then see that there is a runaway slave ad for him. And this is dated 1850. And it describes them. These runaway slave ads are fantastic for describing age and stature and how people described other people then. But this is sort of that example of scratching the surface on agency and taking matters into their hands and and showing everyday resistance by trying to run away. He must have been apprehended because he shows up in the 1855 ledger being appraised at $600, and he is rheumatic. He's only 45 years old. So we've now been able to trace, we know at least when he was, we know a date of he was here. We know that he ran away. He must have been apprehended. What happens to him after 1855, we don't know. Another example is a gentleman named Harman Gaskins. He is also on that 1836 mortgage record. And then he's listed in the 1855 Forsythe ledger to be auctioned. And it says badly ruptured. So it's like herniated at 45 years old. But we see that in 1867, he registered to vote here in Santa Rosa County. And then in 1870, he shows up on the census living with E.E. Simpson, Ezekiel Simpson. So Simpson potentially purchased Harman Gaskins from the Forsythe estate. And then in 1870, so post-emancipation, he is a domestic servant living with the Simpson household, which is just incredibly interesting. And it makes me wonder if Harman could be the individual who was at the Simpson house when the Civil War was happening. It's a stretch, but he has enough of a history with them. He might have been a trusted person to have him look after their estate. And just for reference, Florida Memory has an incredible database for voter registration. It is super easy to work with, very user-friendly. The database is easy to search for names or places. So I, recommend people checking that resource out because it's proved very useful for us. Another individual we have is a woman named Peggy, and we have an advertisement for her in 1848. She's been committed to the jail, so she was apprehended or taken up, and she says she belongs to the estate of John Pelham in Alabama. It goes on to describe her again, which are interesting points of reference. But it says she came to this county in company with a Negro man who ran away from here 6 or 7 years since, who has recently returned to his master, Joseph Forsythe. The owner will come forward, prove property, and take her away, or she will be dealt with according to law. Well, the interesting thing is William Harrison, the sheriff of Santa Rosa County, was also the superintendent of the Arcadia textile mill, which is just another convenient way to potentially acquire enslaved people through the convict, jail system. So it's curious, perhaps Harrison brought it to Forsythe and said, hey, you could claim her, because in 1855, we see a Peggy Anderson married to a Henry Anderson. The gentleman wasn't named by name in the ad, but if he was Henry, they may have been married before or created a union after. But this is likely to be the same Peggy, perhaps. And then one of the most really interesting documents that we have is about a woman named Eliza. In Forsythe's last will and testament, it's the image at the top, he directs that his girl Eliza be sent to a free state with her 3 eldest children, and that $600 or $6,000, hard to tell, that a set of money would be put aside for the maintenance and education of these children, the 3 eldest children. And we can even see in the subsequent ledger books where they are paying for Eliza and children and doling out those funds. And we can see too that his wishes were honored. And we can see her in the census showing up in New York in 1855, same year Forsythe put this in his will. We see Eliza Forsythe living in New York with 4 children. So he specifically says in his will, the 3 eldest children, which are Laura, Francis, and Augustus, but there is a baby named Susan. And we see her on the auction list for Forsythe's estate. She's 15 months old. It says Eliza, infant of Susan. And I've racked my brain for the longest time since we've kind of put this all together, you know, why? Why wasn't that infant or the 4th child included in the last will and testament? And it is really hard to say. And, you know, you can kind of hypothesize, but it's a really interesting facet because it's not uncommon to set an enslaved person free with an estate. That happened pretty frequently, but the intricacy on this, and of course, the curiosity is, were those Forsythe's children? And unfortunately, for the census in 1855, it marks them as mulatto. So it's really difficult to tell. If she had been marked Black and the children had been marked mulatto, that would have been a little bit stronger evidence. But we can continue to trace this family in the historic records. And they move after a time. So we can see her, she's moved to New Jersey. You can see her in the 1860 census. This one actually has no race marked. It doesn't say Black, mulatto, or anything. She has since had another child. Interesting too that the 1855 census says that Eliza was born in Florida, but the 60 census says Maryland. I don't know if that's a fluke. I noticed the person before her being recorded was Maryland, and it might have been just the laziness of the census taker kind of making that mistake. We see her again in 1870, but it does mark them all as Black. But again, there's some bias there because the census taker could have very well been white and maybe didn't even understand the difference in a sense. So you can't really trust exactly what it says in the race category, but it says that she's employed as a washerwoman, and she's added another child to her family. And what's really interesting is in 1876, the 3 children sued the Forsythe estate because the funds were exhausted and the payments stopped showing up. So they sued the Forsythe estate. And by this point, Ezekiel Simpson has passed. So E.A. Perry was actually handling this court case. And I did not actually find record of what occurred, but I would venture to guess that they were denied and they lost the case because Forsythe's estate was literally exhausted. But this is another situation of trying to kind of flesh out agency and them pursuing something that was promised to them in essence. So we have many, many pages of this court document, so we really need to look through it some more. Another individual that we can see, we've got a Charles White. We see him at the first time in the 1855 auction list, so it's hard to know how long he was at Arcadia or when he arrived. But he's another individual that we can see in the voter registration. I believe his was in Warrington. It could have been, I can't see because that's blocking me. But we see his voter registration. And then there is a Charles White listed in Milton in 1870 in the census. And this is the kind of thing that can lead us to even trying to find descendant communities. That's one of our goals and has been at Arcadia, to try and start piecing these stories together so that we can try to reach out and find some of these descendants of the original Arcadia people. One last one, we've got an Andy Williams that shows up in the 1855 auction list. And then we see an Andrew Williams in 1870, and the ages align. He was 40 in 1855, and he's 55 in 1870 in Warrington, Escambia County. So that could be the same individual, but it's hard because Andrew Williams is, some of these names are so common and they were used so often. So it's at least a starting point. And so to kind of switch gears, the question becomes, where does archaeology fit into all of this? We have these amazing historic records, but how can we pair them and how do they complement the archaeological record? And again, kind of keeping in mind that definition that we're looking at, trying to see the enslaved's ability to fashion their lives and institutions in ways that alleviated their burden and gave them a little bit of control in their lives. So we have two different occupation areas that we've investigated of enslaved people. One of them is, we call it Area A. We're so unclever. But Area A, and it's located up in our nature trails here at Arcadia. We don't really have it necessarily marked, but we talk about it on tours and in our exhibit. But Area A was excavated for multiple field school seasons, and we found a wide variety of material culture. And clearly, this was not just one household. This was a large number of individuals living up here. And it seemed as though it was perhaps dormitory style housing or one giant structure, which was common and has been seen in other areas in the South. And it really took, again, Ryland Thomas, I got to give him credit. We found naval buttons in this area, and he found a record in the National Archives where Forsythe was purchasing surplus Navy clothing for the enslaved. And it just, those couple of buttons in that document is what helped us to really solidify that this was an enslaved occupation. That's the whole way that we identified it, because it's tough seeing, it's lower socioeconomic material, but we can't just absolutely say that that's enslaved, because there were also lower status whites at this time too. So, can we make inferences about agency or people putting control into their lives from the artifacts that we find? And this is just a snapshot of the things that we have found in that area. We found a lot of lead shot. And I know for a long time, there's been a misconception that enslaved people weren't armed. And a lot of time, they weren't necessarily, but they were sometimes given the ability to hunt or food procurement to supplement the rations that they're given. So we found a lot of lead shot. We also found a gig, or like a harpoon, that's those two upper images. And it makes you question, or is this them providing for themselves beyond the provisions of enslavement? Or could these arms represent protection and assertion and asserting some control from a defense standpoint? So these are questions, we have to ask when we find artifacts like that. We also found a very high frequency of pipe stems and pipe bowls. So again, could this actually be viewed as an attempt to alleviate some strife with this sort of recreational activity? Or is it literally just that was a very typical recreational activity for the time period? We also found snuff bottle fragments too. So it also speaks to access to these items. Sometimes we think, oh, well, enslaved people wouldn't have access to anything, but they did, and we see evidence of that frequently. We also found textile machine parts. We found shuttle tips, which is the image on the bottom, and then brass rivets, which is the one there to the right. So what do these artifacts mean, and why are they showing up in the living quarters? Is this a sign of resistance? There have been accounts from other areas, which you don't know if it really happened or if it was just the white bias, but taking machine parts or dismantling things so they didn't function properly. Could this be an indicator of resistance, or was it literally that it wound up in someone's pocket and came back with them? So just different ways of trying to look at these artifacts. And in this area, we also found an ink bottle fragment and 9 slate fragments that could have possibly been a slate writing tablet. And there was 1 pencil lead fragment. So somebody living there potentially was literate or attempting to be literate. And again, that's a little bit of that agency in trying to assert some control. These images are really big, so it takes it a minute to. So kind of switching gears to the other end of the site, down at the bottom of the image on the right, down to the Simpson lot, we've investigated this area quite a bit. This is where the big house sat, or where the Simpson family lived. We have the modern day Simpson House that is still standing and is a historic house museum. We also have one known cabin that we call Structure 1. There's also a brick-lined well, and then a water tower foundation from the later kind of farming period. But this is sort of our antebellum landscape that we have to work with, trying to figure out arrangement and why certain structures were placed where they were. And it definitely has the contrast of high status and low status as well. So this is a great photograph of the Simpson House that we didn't always have. And the part of the Simpson House is great because it actually showed us areas that we hadn't seen before in photographs, but it gives another angle of the cabin that sat pretty close to it. And what's really interesting about this is that we didn't know this cabin existed until a descendant stopped by one day, and he shared the bottom right image and said that it used to stand on that property. And then we noticed that it looks like there's a little like pump house or like a well cover. And we knew right where the brick line well was on site. So finding the structure archaeologically, it was almost too easy. And we've interpreted it today. So if you visit Arcadia Homestead, you can see where this cabin was and learn more about that structure. So we've kind of analyzed all the photographs, trying to, glean what we can about this cabin and who potentially would have lived in it based on the archaeological record. And this structure had a really long life. We don't know its exact date of construction, but it was likely to be around 1835, late 1830s, after the Simpson House was built. And it stood until the early 2000s. And I hate that I didn't get to lay eyes on it before it was dismantled. But it had successive use in a variety of ways, because it was used as a domestic residence. And then in the 1970s, it was used for rock band practice. The Simpson descendants who lived there named it the Castle and had rock band practice in it. And then I am fortunate that when they dismantled the structure, they did take pictures and documented it. So we have a variety of photographs of this house being dismantled and even a little bit speaking to its construction. So we do have that, but its long life also kind of muddies the archaeological record. We've investigated over several field schools, and a master's thesis by Catherine Sims was written about the yard space. Being a saddlebag structure, it would have had 2 rooms and a central chimney that serviced both, opened up to either side. So it's likely that it was 2 different families, or at least 2 individuals sharing this structure. And we have found some interesting features related, but I will say it's very common to find vinyl record fragments sitting right next to a cut nail. So the strata is a little tricky to interpret. But we've uncovered a lot of the architectural features. You can see from this map that Catherine Sims did, you can see where we've uncovered the piers. We've also found evidence of potential ritual or kind of religious service. So in the bottom image, if you look inside that L-shaped pier, there is a cast iron kettle that was overturned and kind of placed there in the corner. And it seems pretty intentional. We obviously can't say that for certain, but kettles are ubiquitous during the antebellum period. Everyone used them for cooking, but they also had religious purposes. And it's something we interpret here at Arcadia through our Admiring the Hush Arbor program. Kettles were often taken out into the woods with a group of slaves, and they would sing and pray into these kettles, and they would catch the sound and kind of deaden the sound. And I have a really great quote. They would steal off to the woods with heads together around a kettle to deaden the sound. They called on God out of heavy hearts. So we have a whole program that we do annually at Arcadia just about hush arbors and this kettle that we found. We also uncovered the Chimney Foundation. Only part of it was visible on the surface, so we exposed the entire thing for documentation and preservation purposes, but also the potential that maybe there were features around it. And we were very lucky and that we found a small pit feature on the east opening of the chimney. Pits are often found near hearths in enslaved contexts, and it's generally because they're a root cellar and the warmth keeps the vegetables from freezing. Northwest Florida, I guess we've had some hard freezes here and there, so it's hard to say if they would have practiced that here. This didn't really seem like a root cellar to me. It wasn't really substantial enough for that. Smaller pits are usually storage units, hide things away, especially contraband, but also, ritual practices. But regardless, it's consciously placed artifacts. And after excavating the pit, we found a large, round, kind of metal concreted object. Had no idea what it was. But we sent it off to UWF's lab and had it x-rayed, and it revealed a perfectly round object. And you can see the conserved image on the bottom, and it's likely to be iron canister shot that was used pretty frequently in the Civil War. So if that is the case, it at least gives us a little bit of a date to work from, and that it would not have been acquired probably before 1861. And we did have that documented skirmish at the Simpson House. So it could be that the occupant of the structure at the time acquired this artifact and intentionally buried it. Maybe not necessarily for ritual purposes. It could also be because this could be melted down into a lot of other bullets. Or melted down into something else. So knowing whether it had meaning to them or not, we don't know, but maybe even just that resistance and survival mode with this object. And like I said, Catherine Sims wrote a master's thesis about the yard space, which again starts to scratch the surface about agency and control. And she tried to determine if there was a yard space that was identifiable based on even compact soils from constantly being swept. Yard sweeping was really common in the antebellum period, regardless of race, but it does have ties to African cultural practices. So what Sims found is that we definitely have significant cultural deposits in the front and backyards of the structure. And the earliest materials from the 19th century are concentrated in areas that would have been visually blocked from the big house, which is really interesting because that goes to that intentionality and trying to assert some control over daily life, even if it's just the way you treat your yard space. So this is something that I think we'll continue to look into as we look deeper into Arcadia. And lastly, there's more to be investigated, especially from an archaeological standpoint. And my working hypothesis is that the majority of the enslaved people were living just off our property, on private property. And we thankfully did get a little bit of archaeological research done in the 1980s. And architectural material was found every other shovel test. Coincidence, maybe, but that is a decent indicator of potentially even spaced cabins, which was a common arrangement in the antebellum period, and family recollections that really date back. Some of the elders in the Simpson family recalled the houses being to the east. So maybe someday we'll be able to investigate this area and learn more from the material culture aspect. So the research is ongoing, and this is just an attempt to get beyond kind of the superficial look at the documents. Here's a census record, here's a shipping manifest. We really have to look deeper so we can start weaving these people's stories, because it's our job, and we should be committed, to doing that for interpretive purposes. So with that, I will be happy to open it up to questions. If there's any in the chat, I can stop sharing so that I can see the chat. Let's see. Dr. Bentz asked, weren't the female slaves purchased for the textile mill the first example around here of having females valued for the detailed work that produced the product that was the basis of the business? Absolutely. Now, granted, I've been so narrow focused on Arcadia for so long that comparative research is always kind of on the back burner and something that I need to do more of. But in all of my research and everyone else's that I've read, I haven't seen any other example like that in this area of this heavy female presence in a skilled setting that I know of. I have not seen that anywhere else. I mean, typically females were looked at as domestic servants or looking after children or cooks. They weren't typically put in a skilled setting like a mill. So, yeah. Where do you obtain funding for this research? Great question. So up until a few years ago, Arcadia Mill Archaeological Site was funded with legislative funding from the state of Florida that Dr. Judy Bentz secured. And unfortunately, that was vetoed in 2018. So for the last few years, we have really cut back. We've reduced our operations. We're just open 2 days a week. And the staff, myself, Crystal, we've all taken on other roles to supplement being employed here. So funding is a constant battle, and we're hopeful that we can find something sustainable because it is so important to continue this research. For so long, we have focused on the mills or the white people, and we really have to be looking at the disenfranchised and looking at these people that have almost no voice. So we hope that we can continue this, and you guys even tuning in today is just, that's support that we gladly take. Any other questions anybody wants to throw in the chat? All right. Well, thank you everyone for tuning in. We would love to do this again. This was ambitious to start, especially with my use of agency. And this will probably roll into some sort of scholarly presentation or paper, but keep an eye out for Arcadia. Check out our website, check us out on social media. We're constantly trying to serve the community and keep educating. So we appreciate you. Thanks for tuning in.